Cecilia? So, good morning everyone, and welcome to our second day of SCRIBEMUS conference. I'm very glad to open this morning session, and I invite here our first speaker, Ilaria Fusani. Ilaria Fusani is a final year PhD student in musicology within a co-tutorial program between the University of Cologne, Germany, and the University of Pavia, Department of Cremona, and she is a final year PhD student until tomorrow, because tomorrow Ilaria she will discuss her PhD thesis. So best wishes for your discussion tomorrow. And this morning our presentation is about notational roots and hybridization implications and the pneumatic developments of the Ravennate notation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giovanni, for your introduction, and thanks to the SCRIBEMUS committee for organizing this important conference. My presentation will focus on detecting the main writing influences that led to the development of the Ravennate notation from the late 10th to the 12th century. The liturgical sources with Ravennate notation date from the late 10th to the 12th century. The earliest discoveries of these sources is connected to the Ravennate area. They were found, in fact, in local libraries and archives, and contains specific chants of the Ravennate liturgy. These elements led scholars, as Giacomo Baroffio, to identify this pneumatic style as characteristic of Ravenna, from which derived the term Ravennate notation. Before tracing path of direct and indirect influences, it is important to first identify the internal characteristic of a given notation within a manuscript. Only after this internal analysis can the comparison be advanced, allowing for a more detailed detection of the connection with close notational styles and also their impact on the development of the notation over time. This is the particular case of the Ravennate notation, but also of the several notational styles across Italy. Given the object of my paper, I will mainly focus on the context of the Ravennate notation with other pneumatic families, the systematic classification of the Ravennate notational features, and the integration of diastemacy within the notational practices in Ravenna over time has been the main topic of my doctoral research, but today I will pay more attention to the connection with the other pneumatic families. By examining the sources with the Ravennate notation, and especially their pneumatic features and the treatment of diastemacy, it is possible to distinguish three main notational typologies. Adiastematic notation, characterized by no direct visual indication of pitch. However, in some subtypes of adiastematic notation, there were diastematic strategies and also some initial attempts to visually indicate pitch in terms of spatialization. The neumes are placed along a horizontal axis and show a wide variety of pneumatic forms, with, for example, looped neumes and quilismatic forms. Notation of a diastematic tendency shows a reduction and a standardization of the pneumatic vocabulary, an increased writing contrast, and more precise indication of pitch relations, but without the system of lines, letter clefs, and custos, along also with the pneumatic features of the staff notation. Staff notation employs the Guidonian staff with the line, letter clefs, and custos. The pneumatic vocabulary is further decreased, and also some occasional looped neumes with Beneventan and Roman features appear in some sources. I have subdivided the adiastematic typologies into further subtypes. Type 1 is represented by this fragment, now conserved at the Clasense Library in Ravenna. This is a late 10th century fragment of a breviary, and is one of the earliest known sources in Ravennate notation. The neumes are placed according to a horizontal axis without conveying precise pitch indications for what concerns the visual placement of the neumes. The ductus is cursive with a writing axis that tends to the right, and the pneumatic form show hybrid elements, recalling Bolognese and Central Italian morphologies, with also connection on a general level with West Frankish and South Frankish notation. The melodic comparison with East and West Frankish notations, as well as Bologna, show different degrees of connection. For example, the chants begin in Ravenna with virga puntum and pes as the Sangal notation, and differently from the Noyon notation, but according also to the Bolognese style. However, the rest of the chants in Ravennate notation accord more closely to the Noyon and Bolognese style. See, for example, the joint climacus on Domine, ligated with the loop form in Ravenna and Noyon. Next to it, we can observe a specific quilismatic context and restupinum neumes that align more closely the Ravennate notation again to Bologna and Noyon. On expectaxti and meum, for example, the affinities of Ravenna and Bologna are evident. And in fact, in this case, Ravenna used the quilismatic form of Bologna. This is the typical quilismatic form of Bologna that remains closely the Bolognese style. A pneumatic form that can be largely related to East Frankish styles, as Bobbio, is the semi-looped torculus that reminds of East Frankish types, rather than Bologna or West Frankish tradition. Different is the case, however, in case of the torculus resupino, that relies again more closely to West Frankish types and specifically to Hispanic types. The main path of influences remain the Toscan and Bolognese area, and on a border level, the West Frankish and South Frankish notations. The pneumatic comparison permits to identify and to confirm the relation of the Ravennate notation to the Bolognese style. However, the analysis permitted to detect deeper pneumatic affinities with the Central Italian notations. For example, in the manner of tracing the reiterated virga in context of unisonic passages, with a writing axis that strongly tends to the right, and, for example, the elongation of the lines to convey pitch indications. Also, the joint climacus, with the loop forms that relate closely to the Tuscan area, as Pistoia and Lucca. The quilisma shows affinities with Hispanic forms, but on a closer level, the pneumatic similarities in the formation of the wavy elements are again with the Toscan sources. Particular is the fact that this Ravennate style employs two forms of quilisma, the Bolognese type and the wavy style of East Frankish derivation, West Frankish and South Frankish derivation. Another subtype of a diastematic notation is observed in the Missal from Ranchio with signature W11 at the Walter Art Gallery in Baltimore, which was notated by two different hands. The comparison in the slide involved tradition of Ravenna, Lucca, Novalesa, Ravenna, Bologna, Lucca, Novalesa, and Saint-Marc-de-Fassé. From the beginning of the chants, the closer affinities of the Ravennate notation are again with Bologna, particularly in the use of the torculus initio debilis, which appears in semi-loop form in Ravenna, but the other sources, in contrast, use a torculus with a tractus with a strong attack. On the word meos, the sources show different behaviors. Ravenna employs punctum and correctus. Bologna and Lucca show a pespi virga. Novalesa and Saint-Marc-de-Fassé use a torculus resupinus. A liquescent pes used by all sources on in, but in the Ravennate diastematic notation, the liquescent pes has a strong base, a tractulus with an acute angle, that this is the common liquescent form for pes in the Ravennate diastematic notation. This morphology differs from the semi-rounded pes seen in the other sources. At the end of this section, the sequence of punta and virga in Ravenna reminds of Lucca Novalesa, while Bologna uses longer tractulus according to its own pneumatic style. The pneumatic choices of Ravenna reflect both individual writing and articulatory conventions, as well as different degrees of interconnection with Bologna and these other traditions, specifically Tuscany. Ravenna, but specifically the Ravennate scribes, reshaped external pneumatic models to develop a peculiar writing style that was then standardized within a process of pneumatic reduction and writing stiffening. Another type of a diastematic Ravennate notation is conveyed by the breviary from Pomposa that date from the 11th century. By looking at the pneumatic variety, an almost complete communality with the notation of the Baltimora manuscript, the W11, can be detected. Differences regard the pneumatic handwriting, having here more contrast, similarly to the second hand of the Missal W11, but also some specific neumes of Bolognese style. By identifying the most significant differences for what concern the pneumatic shapes, we detect neumes deriving from the oldest Ravennate type and the Bolognese style. For example, the quilismatic shape that shows similarities to the typical Bolognese quilisma and the oldest Ravennate notation. Another shapes is in context of Scandicus that can be seen in the form composed by Tractoli, that follows the respective form of the oldest Ravennate fragment and the Bolognese script. The manuscript W11 does not use Tractoli, neither isolator nor in the Scandicus form or Climacus. Again, the loop in the Torculus initio debilis, close to the Bolognese script, that show a closed ring, while the already seen Ravennate typology only employed the semi-loop form. A corpus of fragments from the second half of the 11th century reflect a more diastematic tendency. This corpus can be divided into further groups. The first of it is older, and it comes from the second half of the century. The neumes have stronger features and more contrast in the handwriting, getting similar form to the notational stuff. The pneumatic variety previously identified start here to decrease. The second group shows a more precise diastematic organization of the neumes. The neumes are positioned in a manner that makes possible to determine pitch relationship between sounds. I apply a hypothetical staff system to this fragment, thanks to the comparison with 12th century sources of Ravenna. We can notice the diastematic tendency, which is almost precise despite some small increases. And I think that the system of lines, or in general, a more precise method related to the system of line, or in general diastemacy, was probably known by the scribe of this manuscript. Perhaps the structure of the book and the small pace for the music writing did not permit a more precise and full integration of the system of lines or a more precise indication of diastemacy. Another element concerns the morphologies of the neumes, which can be related to the pneumatic form on staff notation. Another feature is that the pneumatic variety previously identified start here to missing. The comparison between Ravennate and West Frankish sources reveals a shared tendency toward pneumatic standardization, marked by a gradual stiffening of the ductus and increased graphic contrast. Affinities in the shape of these neumes as punta ligated, as in Pest, Torculus, and Clivis, suggest a parallel morphological transformation. While all sources agree in the transcription of the incipit, differences emerge in the notation of other pneumatic form. For example, in the Scandicus Flexus Resupinus on Domine, there illustrate a shift from joint shape in the Resupinus form in the diastematic types to disaggregated form in later sources of Ravenna, following also the solution of the West Frankish notation. The process of writing standardization reaches higher level on the staff notation. The surviving sources with Ravennate notation of staff belong to the 12th century. This manuscript is the Q9 now in Bologna. It consists of Guidonian staff with lines, letter clefs, and custos. Neumes are characterized by the contrast between thick and marked horizontal tracks and thin vertical lines, featured close to the square notation. In particular, the pneumatic forms have features that probably originated from a process of standardization of the earlier pneumatic writing. As already mentioned, the variety of this pneumatic vocabulary disappear, and in fact there is no trace of, for example, quilisma, neumes initio debilis, but also of the pneumatic variety that we observed earlier, for example, the different type of torculus or pes. However, alongside typical Ravennate pneumatic forms, there are signs that derive from external influences. These are requiescent forms that especially affect torculus, sometimes scandicus, and in some cases also clivis and tractus. However, their occurrences are only occasional. These forms may have reached Ravenna through more direct contact with Bolognese and Tuscan manuscripts. The scribal ductus of these neumes show, in fact, closer similarities to this notation of Tuscany and Bologna. These slides present a comparison between Benevento, Florence, Pistoia, Bologna, and Ravenna. All the sources employed loop torculus on the word intellectum. The ductus and the manner of tracing the loop form reveal closer connection to the older type of the Beneventan notation rather than the type on staff. On conspectu, most sources use liquescent torculus, while the Ravennate and Florence notation employ a liquescent pes. But of particular interest is the notation on the word semper, where both the Tuscan and Bolognese sources employ a double clivis with looped element on the second clivis. The Pistoian manuscript show looped element above the second clivis. The loop is above. Here in Pistoia is here above. A similar form also appears usually in Lucca. By contrast, the Ravennate source use double liquescent clivis without any type of loop form or additional graphic features. In general, the pneumatic comparison of the morphologies demonstrate more graphic similarities between the Ravennate and West Frankish notations. Bologna and Tuscany share typical Beneventan and Roman morphologies more systematically, as in loop liquescent forms, the manner of notating the scandicus, or also the directionality of the diagonal tractulus. Ravenna and West Frankish traditions appear similar in the manner of notating each pneumatic element, mainly consisting in punta and tractuli joined together by lines. However, the presence of a specific pneumatic morphology, as the loop torculus, attests a certain degree of connection of the Ravennate notation with Beneventan and Roman elements. The loop neume shows stronger graphic similarities with Bologna and Tuscan sources, suggesting the hypothesis that the presence of these neumes in Ravenna reflects indirect connection to Benevento and Rome through the Tuscan Emilian area. In particular, the gradual of Forlimpopoli, the Modena 7, also employs other loop form of Beneventan and Roman derivation, as the loop porrectus, the tractulus, and clivis. However, these are only sporadic occurrences. Thank you. The development of the Ravennate notation illustrates various degrees of interconnection with several pneumatic traditions. The earliest source in Ravennate notation from the late 10th century represent a hybrid style of notation with, on a general level, West Frankish and Hispanic influences, for example, in the resupinum neumes, quilismatic form, but also in the loop shape. Closer morphological contacts are instead with Bologna and, in my opinion, on a higher level with the center of Italy. By the first half of the 11th century, the notation started to develop a more individual notational style, showing also features of West Frankish tradition. This notational type still shares closest affinity with Bologna and Tuscan sources, but in a more individual and pneumatic style, internally developed. During the late 10th and the 12th centuries, the Ravennate scribes increasingly developed a notation of a diastematic tendency, gradually refined the spatial organization of the notation to convey more precise information of pitch. This intrinsic development shows parallelism with the approach of the West Frankish notation, particularly in the gradual increase of writing contracts and the lesser use of looped neumes, and also as well as by using similar pneumatic morphologies as punta ligated together. The 12th century notation staff has specific features, with heavy writing contracts and the absence of the pneumatic variety that characterized the earlier Ravennate notational practice. While developing according to the graphic transformation into more rigid form, the notation shows similarities to the West Frankish notational staff. However, the presence of Beneventan and Roman elements, particularly in this loop form of, for example, Torculus, liquescent Torculus, indicate a certain degree of contact with this notation of Benevento and Roma. The similarity with these morphologies found in Bologna and Tuscany support the hypothesis that these pneumatic elements were integrated in the Ravennate notation through more direct connection with the Tuscan Emilian area. These notational networks and connection could convey more information on the notational path of certain pneumatic elements, and the process of hybridization underlined the development of the several notational styles across the Padano area and the center of Italy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. Any questions? Okay. Please, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. I think this is an excellent paper. It's very clear, and you've managed to demonstrate all the degrees of various influences and so on. So I think this is just what we need. Thank you very much. In fact, I have got very little to ask. Terminology, perhaps. You've said, you've talked about pneumatic reduction. Do you mean, at some point you said, you used the expression pneumatic reduction. I imagine you mean the reduction of the, in the variety of the notational alphabet or notational vocabulary, sorry. I suppose, but, and I also have another question, which is, again, it's not quite a question, but the last graph, the last diagram that you showed, I think it was really needed, because at some point in the paper I thought, okay, I can see all these influences, but I miss kind of the more general picture, and you've provided it right at the end, so thank you for that. But in fact, you quite, yeah. I would just simplify this by, because you still use the terminology West Frankish and Hispanic influences. And I'm afraid I really don't want to, advertise too much our work, but I would just say South Frankish, you see. I mean, which intrinsically has a clear derivation from West Frankish notation, clearly. but then it has a kind of a rather more independent development, and I think Ravenna fits into that picture. My sense is that, and therefore I would leave out West Frankish and Hispanic from the late 10th century stage. Half 11th century, again, West Frankish with traces of Hispanic influences that can also be kind of transformed into or simplified into a South Frankish definition, in my opinion. So there's that, and okay, I think I'll stop here. Pneumatic reduction and your diagram.
Thank you very much. With the pneumatic reduction, I intend.
Francesco.
I could not show the pneumatic diagram of the pneumatic variety that was used in the diastematic Ravennate notation. So it will be probably more clearer in the explanation of this pneumatic reduction. By the last part of the 11th century, all of the pneumatic variety that we observed in the diastematic notation disappeared. So, for example, there were many types of paths of low-high neumes that disappeared, and probably is clear. Okay. There are different types of paths here, but except for the liquescent types, in the staff notation style, the path is just one, in addition to the liquescent type, or the torculus. There in the diastematic notation appear in different variations, as nizio debilis with the strong attack, or also the cadential torculus. There are many types of torculus in the diastematic notation that in the staff notation disappear. But I noticed that there is in the second hand of the Missal of Baltimore, of the Missal of Ranchio, this type, the writing starts to be more rigid, with more writing contrast, but the looped neumes remain. There are also more visual indication of pitch, but on a very low level. And then we have the diastematic tendency, the notation of diastematic tendency that do not use any type of loop neumes. So there is this shift, except for this first group of fragments. There are just 5 fragments. There is no looped shape, but there is still the use of bivirga in the diastematic type, or also the use of a clear oriscus in context of frestus. They're usually in the staff notation of Ravenna is with clavis is connected. It's not oriscus. I don't know if there is any type of. No, I don't think. Okay. Yes, I intend this type of pneumatic reduction. I don't know if I answer your question or.
Molto sintetica perché
Could you repeat please?
il diagramma, l'ultimo slide.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Molto sintetica non serve per
Yeah. Okay.
So do you think that the South Frankish could be a good expression instead of Hispanic?
Yeah, but especially from the. I don't know if it will be suitable for the transition from a diastematic to the staff, in my opinion. But I don't know, because probably there is historical also connection. There could be. I intend to the local figures that have some kind of Catalan formation. I don't know if there is a concrete, a direct influence of this historical dynamic in the transformation of the, and also just brief, the Ravennate notation, the Ravennate area shows some degrees of contact also with Cluny, and so, yeah.
Grazie mille. I have a double questions concerning the exchanges between West Frankish and Northern Italy, and why did you choose Saint-Maur? You know probably that Saint-Maur, like Fleury, is a very separated tradition from West Frankish at the end of the 11th and 12th century. And did you take Saint-Maur because it was already influenced by the southern Italy with San Benedictus and Monte Cassino and so on?
Yeah, thank you. I think that if I understood correctly, because I cannot hear very much from me, I'm sorry. I think that the development of the notation is an interesting development of the writing style that has a parallel with South Frankish, West Frankish notations. Probably also in light of the earlier influences. Because now I did not show the transformation of the notation of the West Frankish notation, but there is this increased stiffening of the writing also in northern France.
And do you think it has been influenced at two times in two different periods, in the 11th and then in 12th, and back between France and Italy several times? Not only one time, but exchanges.
Probably some type of exchange remain during also from a historical level, but for Ravenna and the local figures that were in Ravenna is a bit difficult to concretely demonstrate that these local figures have concrete impact on the transformation of on the influences of the notational style, because there are many.
And what about Brescia? Do you think Brescia could be added in your corpus? What about Brescia? Brescia. Do you think we can add this center?
Exactly.
With
Okay. Yeah, there is a notational type that is close to Ravenna, but also in Venice, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so I think that in the northern part of Italy there was this type of more northern Frankish notation. Thank you.
So another question, please, Matthias, and then Susan. I ask you to be.
I connect directly to the first comment of Giovanni. I have a general question. How much can you say about really the religious communities where the manuscripts are in use? I do not talk about leaves because this is sometimes very tricky, but the full manuscripts. You are around in a zone where exactly at that time in the first half of the 11th century, there is something going around the pre-Gregorian phase, and this space is connected to what we call this, what we yesterday saw. San Vicente de Ravenna is a pupil of the school in the Pyrenees and connected exactly to this world. And my question is, and together with Romuald, they were the founders of the idea of Camaldoli and all the Reformed Benedictines. And how much can we say? Are these monastic manuscripts? Are they from cathedrals? Are they from clerical communities? This is very important. All historians forget about that text transfer, knowledge transfer, does go around in different competing networks. And this is what I have to solve in my paper as well, because I have these fragments from Italy, and I really ask me, why do they need, these were full manuscripts before, Italian notation in manuscripts in Catalonia. So is this a form of retransfer? Do they introduce Italian style there in communities? Tortosa, for example, but that is Saint-Ruf. This is quite different. Saint-Ruf had contacts with Lucca, for example. We know that. This is the Reform Canon Regulars movement in the also early 11th century. So we have to reflect it from this standpoint as well. So I would like to know, do you know from Ravenna, Bologna, Tuscany, Lucca? do you know something? Von der Avellana, una cosa así. And other monasteries, very important monasteries and communities.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. I have advanced historical, I would say historical investigation, but would be very long. So I studied an historical investigation of the Ravennate Notation, but I will further advance this historical investigation in the project with Rigo about the Tuscan sources close to Camaldoli and to the central part of Tuscany. I noticed that, for example, the missal from Ranchio is of Camaldolese. Sorry, the first one. Yeah. Also for Romuald of Ravenna, he has, if I remember correctly, also a Catalan formation for a period. He went to exactly, and and also then come back to Santa Pol after probably Arezzo, or before he came back to Santa Pollinare in class in Ravenna. And he was also connected with Arezzo and Theodald of Arezzo. So this is a kind of analysis that I studied with my PhD, but just in the last part of my PhD. And so I am interested in going on with the research with the project of Rigo and on the Tuscan sources close to Camaldoli, because I think that it was probably important in the networks of notational types and on the diffusion of the notational type, and also probably on the staff system, but I need to do more research on it.
Okay, so please, Susan.
I have lots of questions for you, and I'm just going to put one. But before I get to that, can I just, in relation to what Giovanni and Matthias have just said, we need to think really seriously about how to use denominations name for script families. And I just want to protest that West Frankish, which I invented in the 9th century, and we have to think in a different way for the 10th and 11th century names. That's a discussion that has to be had, but relating the names to chronology and places matters. And obviously when you get to the 11th century, you've got lots and lots of many more sources and much more detail. And if you name something Ravennate Notation, you're dealing with a really small situation compared to using words like West Frankish and South Frankish. So I just want to put that on the table. Let me ask you one small question. Somewhere quite early on, you showed us pictures of neumes which were like a quilisma, but the upside down one, a quilisma going down, which I haven't found anybody writing about, but it turns up in lots of places. And the kind of central place that I always refer it back to is the famous Montpellier manuscript from Dijon, which is connected with William Volpiano. So the question is, this going down quilisma, have you thought about it? And where do you find it? And can we get any closer to understanding what it means and where it's being used?
I'm very sorry, but I couldn't hear very much because of
I'm sorry. Do you want to try?
So
I'm very sorry.
the question was.
Untangled without relying on or this kind of thing. So that's the first observation, which I think, speaking to my team, we should note this down for further discussion. And the second question was about if I understood correctly. That's the one, for example, from
Yeah. Dramatic bass.
Well, there was an earlier slide that had a very clear descending quilisma.
Perhaps the ones
Well,
anyway, I'm sure.
Yeah.
No, no.
no, go backwards. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, that's the one. That is a descending quilisma.
Yeah.
So did you understand the question about Montpellier and the Montpellier manuscript of William of Volpiano? And this sign appears in that manuscript over and over and over. And so I've always connected it with Northern Italy. But I'd like to see more.
Yeah, I think that probably the closer closer connection where I don't know if that's true, but I see something like Limacus with these very Schendian elements also in Tuscany. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm so sorry to interrupt our very interesting conversation, but we are very late, so we need to move to our second speaker. So thank you very much to Ilaria. So please, Chiara Mazzoletti. So, Chiara Mazzoletti is a PhD candidate in musicology and a member of the ERC Sound Space project. And she holds a master's degree in musicology from the University of Pavia Cremona and a master of advanced studies in Gregorian chant from the Università della Svizzera Italiana. Her paper today is Musical Notations and Scribal Networks in the Marca di Tuscia, 10th, 11th century, the case of Lucca. Thank you, Chiara.
Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you again to the SCRIBEMUS team for organizing this conference. The flourishing and transformation of notational practices in 10th and 11th century in northern Tuscany, the circulation of knowledge, scribal mobility, and the political events together helped the researcher to delineate a clearer picture of what has always been one of the most complex regions of Italy. My starting point was the monastic missal from the Benedictine monastery of San Salvatore in Sesto, close to Lucca. The number of monasteries dedicated to San Salvatore is impressive, but the provenance of Lucca 606 has been proven for sure because of the presence in the canon of both San Salvatore and Comitius, and the only monastery having dependencies devoted to this saint is the one of the Ventina Lake benches. The manuscript dates back to the second half of the 11th century, probably 1030 and 1070. The span of time has been deduced due to liturgical and paleographical matters, and the full explanation is going to be published in the upcoming Cantus Planus proceedings. The book presents two pneumatic notations. The main one is an adiastematic notation, and the second one is the Beneventan notation we find in the section commonly called Supplementum, and as an addition at folio 137 recto. It is not preserved at the Biblioteca Capitolare Feliniana of Lucca, and it probably entered the library at the end of the 14th, beginning of 15th century, because I have this suggestion that it can be traced in a catalogue preserved in a capitular archive, chef mark manuscript RR43 from the 15th century, where a liber prologi beati Hieronymi presbiteri in bonis cartis cui comitis appellatur is listed. And we can notice that these are the information we find at folio 6 versus and 7 rector, after the abbreviated martyrologium, where the actual book begins. When we talk about Tuscany, we refer to a service with borders that were delineated in 1948, and it can be questionable, historically and geopolitically speaking, to talk about the region without having clear what was happening in this area during the 10th and 11th centuries. According to historians, the most accurate name for this period is Mark of Tuscia. The borders we have to consider are controlled by a marquess, and its cultural asset is shaped by the imperial family. The marca was an intermediate structure which, until the last quarter of the 11th century, organized the local societies, whose activities unfolded primarily within an urban area, and regulated their relations with imperial authority. To understand the political web of relations linking the imperial family with the powerful monastic institution of Tuscia, we must go back to the 12th December 937, the date of two twin diplomas that contained the establishment of the dower of Berta of Swabia, widow of Queen of Burgundy, and that of her daughter Adelaide, the future Queen of Italy. The dowers was constituted at the time of the engagement of the mother Berta to Hugh of Ars, King of Italy, and of the daughter to Lothar II, Hugh's son and already associated with his father on the throne. The two parchments have come down to us within the archive of the monastery of San Salvatore in Pavia, a fact that might appear self-evident since that monastery was refounded and rebuilt by Adelaide herself 35 years after her engagement, on what remained of an ancient Lombard oraculum. Only Adelaide's intervention would transform it into a cenobium. As an additional strict relationship between Pavia, Piacenza, and Lucca, this last one, considered by King Hugh as his second capital city, are well documented. The geographical distribution and the nature of the assets contained in the two documents help us to understand the area of control exercised by these two queens. Adelaide, in particular, by virtue of her long life and political fortune, later became the matriarch of the Ottonian dynasty and, for more than half a century, administrated the three major imperial abbeys of Tuscia, San Salvatore of Sesto, Monte Amiata, and Sant'Antimo. We know instead that other important institutions were under the direct authority of the Bishop of Lucca, such as San Frediano and San Silvestro of Lucca, or under the external power, such as of the Bishopric of Parma, which administrated through San Giovanni of Palma, San Bartolomeo of Pistoia, and San Salvatore of Fontana Taona. In the time of Otto III and Hughes, the Marquis of Tuscia, at the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, finally, the decision was taken to restructure this and strengthen the system of imperial abbeys. The great imperial monastery of San Salvatore in Sesto, now destroyed and its archive dispersed, was once the richest institution among the ones enlisted in Berta's and Adelaide's possessions. It did not belong to a peripheral area, and a reconceptualization of this cenobium has been done by Vignodelli and Tomei. This is the context we must consider for the arrival of the Beneventan notation in a Benedictine monastery of the area of Lucca, in a territory dominated at the time by a diastematic notation. The folios of Lucca 606, bearing Beneventan notation from 150 recto till 165 versus, have already been studied by Thomas Kelly and Giulio Miniti. They consider this type 1 Beneventa script as belonging to the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th century. Just to refresh our memory, the text of the supplementum has been written by the male hand of the book, and some layout arrangements were made taking account the extra space that the diastematic Beneventa script requires, mainly a double interline. So, even if it is called supplementum, it is not a later addition, as it can be demonstrated even by the gathering disposition, but it was planned together with the Codex as an appendix bearing alternative repertoire for the Holy Week, proceeding from the tradition of Monte Cassino. Recent studies by Professor Tomei, whom I wish to thank publicly for the information he has shared with me over the past year, provide new evidence that helps us musicologists to explain the presence of Beneventan notation outside the Beneventan area, shedding light on broader question of scribal mobility and the diffusion of notational practices across regional boundaries, a point of exchanges between Tuscia and southern Italy, scribal milieu has been opened because of the discordances between 5 monks and their abbots. The Chronica Monasterica Sinensis tell us that during Mansone's abbacy, 986-996, tensions arose between him and some of the monastery's most prominent monks. Preferring to leave the monastery rather than remain under Mansone, 3 monks went to Jerusalem. 5 other monks whose name have not been preserved, went to central northern Italy, in Lombardia, where they were received with great honor by the Marquis of Tuscia, Duke. By his permission, each of them established a cenobium in Tuscia and administered it according to the Cassinese tradition, Iuxta huius monasterii traditionem. It was noted that 2 abbots active in Tuscia, Ambrogio and Maione, subscribed in Beneventan script. This detail has been overlooked, even though the name of the second abbot, Maione, unusual in Tuscany, is typical of the southern Lombard principalities. The 2 abbots assumed office precisely in the last 5 years of the 10th century and oversaw the imperial abbeys of Lucca, San Ponziano of Lucca, and San Salvatore of Sesto, endowed by Hugh and Otto III. So we have 5 monks for 5 imperial monasteries. For San Salvatore in Lucca, we have Maione attested in 996 till 1004, and then we lost any track of him. For San Salvatore Monte Amiano, we have Winzio attested in the dates that you can see in the slide. For San Ponziano in Lucca, we have Ambrogio, and for Badia Fiorentina in Firenze, we have Marino, and then it has not been able to track down the 5th monk yet. The arrival of the Cassinese monks played a central role in the imperial renovation design. Marino and Ambrogio, the monks with the most elementary level of graphic culture, were assigned to new marginal foundations. Urban abbeys of long gestation was established and had been promoted by Willa, Hugh's mother, but which were brought to a complexion by her son, so the Badia Fiorentina in Firenze and San Ponziano. These were situated in contexts in which the marginal influence over a vibrant aristocratic milieu was extremely strong. Firenze and Lucca were, in fact, the Tuscan city most firmly controlled by the Marquis. The monks with a higher level of graphic culture, Maione and Winzio, were instead appointed to 2 very wealthy royal abbeys of Lombard foundation. Before their arrival, they had been administered directly by Otto III's grandmother, Adelaide, through the dower. It is not coincidence that the arrival of the Cassinese monks took place in the months following the young ruler's attainment of independence and Adelaide's withdrawal into the monastery. Essentially, we are faced with a radical restructuring of the foundation of marginal power in Tuscia. For our interest in Lucca 606, we have a clear case of a script moving with right, with Maione at the end of the 10th century, surviving as a selection of chants in a later manuscripts, and even in a later edition at folio 137 recto. So we have 2 options. The paleographical studies are incorrect and this manuscript belongs to a date closer to Maione's abbacy, or at mid-11th century, after Maione's departure, someone as Salvatore was still able to write in Beneventan script, and the repertoire introduced from Monte Cassino was still sung. Unfortunately, we know very little about abbots preceding and following Maione because the archival dispersal has been severe, and this is the only source that can be directly linked to this cenobium. Since the aim of this paper is not to analyze in detail the diastematic notation of Lucca 606, I like to dedicate this last part of my presentation to briefly introducing a manuscript I recently started working on and that has never been studied properly, but I think it's worth it. Lucca Biblioteca Capitolare Feliniana Manuscript 605, an integrated antiphonal lectionary collectory. According to the bibliography, it belongs to the second half of the 11th century, but I'm still trying to narrow down the date range. It was in use at the Lucca Cathedral for sure. Some scholars attributed it to the area around Arezzo due to its sanctuary, but more recent studies assume that this hypothesis is incorrect. It's a complex book and still a work in progress, so I'm planning to present a complete study soon. Anyway, if we assume that it's from the 11th century that's been written in the Lucca area for the Lucca Cathedral, a preliminary pneumatic comparison with Lucca 606 is in order. The result is that no substantial differences can be found in an elevated number of shapes. Above all, they present the same variety of virge, pedes, clives, and then they have shared shapes for Scandicus, Climacus, and Salicus. Other names show differences related to a change of hand, but they share the same principle. Even when the pes with a broken stroke is present in both manuscripts. Nevertheless, there are at least two shapes that they do not share. And if you look at the slide, the first one is only present in Luca 6:05, while the second one in Luca 6:06. But if we expand the comparison, none of them is unknown in the region. The next step will be to analyze the scribal practices of Luca 6:05, as was already done in my master thesis for Luca 6:06, in order to understand whether at a level of nomadic choices, which in Luca 6:06 are often clear, for example, in the way unisons are indicated, there are any recurring patterns. While the study is taking shape, an increasing number of adiasematic sources, some of them probably from the late 10th century, are emerging from various archives in the Lucca area, and the discovery has been possible only thanks to the collaboration and patience of the archivist, since the material consists mainly of fragments, some of which are still in situ. This may allow better understanding of the scripts, having the possibility to compare neumes from different typologies of liturgical book, both monastic and secular. If we go back to the map showing Berta and Adelaide's possessions, we noted that comparison with sources from Pistoia, Firenze, Arezzo, Siena, and Chiusi are great choices. But what I aim to verify in the near future is whether the road that crosses the Apennine and all the historically documented links between Lucca and Pavia, Piacenza, or Brescia can in some way be traced in musical liturgical sources. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you very much, Chiara. Any questions? Okay, please, Francesca. No, we need the microphone for the YouTube streaming. Yeah. No, but we need the microphone for the YouTube streaming. We need it for the YouTube streaming.
My question goes about yes, we're still discussing. It's okay? Okay. Your paper was, you mentioned many persons, so obviously people in a network, so women, relationship, key names of that period. My question is going about the material of, or the knowledge on this person in Italy, drawn from charters. Because in the 11th century we have more material, we understand from this source type, also personal relationship, economic activities, endowments, donations, and so on, perhaps even book donations. And I discovered a little bit preparing my footnotes, for example, that we can in the Catalan charters, so very rich patrimony, discover also these Italian connections. For example, there's a case, I did not know that this Abbot Garin from Cuja was in contact with Duke of Tuscany, and he made had economic relationship because he needed territories and he purchased things and there. But also Italian names appear in our period, so exactly end of the 10th, 11th century. And I think this is a new also approach to all that, to understand when we have already the names and understand how they endowed religious communities, that we can more and more understand also really this network. It's not only endowment and so on and so on. And then we can go back to the manuscripts and understand them much better. When I saw the first manuscript, this 606, I would like, is it completely digitized? Or do you have only a private digitization? I would like to have a look on that manuscript, because it looks very near to what we know from the zone between Catalonia and Septimania. This is already the style going, because Ripoll at that time starts to develop its own style. Now style we can identify. But Cuja is always related with Ripoll. And they have the exchange. And Oliver was abbot of both. There were several abbots who both abbots of both institutions and others, because there was a small congregation at that time. And this is the connection to Italy then. Therefore, I would like to see this manuscript, and I can say much more on that manuscript. From the paleographic standpoint, I have no idea of musical notation. So, can you say something on that? Yeah.
Manuscripts. There are some folios online on the MMO database, but the complete digitalization has to be paid at the Biblioteca Capitolare. But apart from that, yes, there's an entire project that ended a couple of years ago. It's called Fiscus at the University of Pisa, that has traced down all the relationships, both political and personal, in the Mark of Tuscia. And we are waiting for the publication and the results of this. But I'm in touch with the historians, and so yes, we have more relationship than the one that I showed, obviously, because I didn't have enough time to show all the relationship that we have in this very, very complex region. And another problem we have is that we do not have a list of abbots for this monastery, but they are trying to trace it down the provenance and the origin of monks and abbots, thanks to related documentations. That's mostly fiscal documentations. So it's not actually my field, but I'm in contact with the historians that are doing this kind of job.
The names of monks and abbots, because there appear in our region people who definitely are not Visigothic a name tradition, but Italian. And I would say the other way around, we have to look at that as well. But this is a question for the people specialized in onomastic studies.
Hello. I have a very, very small question. When you say a pest with a broken stroke, you used what terminology did you use? I can't hear. Yes. Do you mean, is it an actual disjoint pes, or is a virga which is has been made into a pes, or is it a tractulus that has been made into a pes by adding a virga? Can you just clarify that? Sorry.
Shapes that are done in many traits, and then they have pedis and torpid too, that are made in two or three temples.
I see.
So
Okay.
something that I'm trying to trace. It's not an error corrected. I had this hypothesis. It's probably another way of tracing pes. No, I haven't tried to do that, to follow that route. It seems that just sometimes they trace the tractulus and then they add the other part of the pes, but not as considered as an error. Just I haven't been able to understand why, but it's consistent.
It's the particular design of that.
Yes.
No? Okay, thank you very much, Chiara, for your paper. And if I may, I think that it should be very useful to focus the research also in the relation between Tuscia and the Lombardy, especially between Brescia and Tuscia and Tuscany. For example, I know a manuscript now in Bologna, produced in the monastery Sant'Andrea al Mosciano, in a staff notation, nota romana if you wanted to use this expression, and soon after used in Brescia. And it's very interesting to understand why it was soon after used in Brescia. And so. No, San Giovanni ad Forum, something like that. I'm not sure about. Yeah, but so I think it could be a good path for your research.
Even because Santa Giulia in Brescia was San Salvatore before becoming Santa Giulia, and it's in the somehow connected to the Marconary network that connects San Salvatore of Pavia and then Salvatore of Sesto. A lot of other San Salvatore